Tom, I was watching the news the other day, and I saw that the Russian government have been paying some podcasters, some like really, really shitty, idiotic podcasters, like $100,000 an episode for 4 episodes a month, like $5 million odd a year, just to talk shit. Why? Why? Where's my $100,000? Is what I'm asking. Why aren't the Russian government giving, or are the Russian government giving you loads of money? You're just not passing it on to me.
Well, I can definitively answer because of my other work on other podcasts. I am fully on a fucking list in the Kremlin, so I'm just going to say that much.
You're an anchor. You're an anchor. You're a drag on our dark money earning potential.
Yes. My left-wing politics are unfortunately making us not marketable to the people at the Kremlin.
I mean, those guys, Dave Rubin, Simple, they've come out and said that they're victims, of like having to carry around all this cash. We have to feel sorry for them.
Yeah, they just have to do like Pablo Escobar. They're just like burying it everywhere, burning it. I don't know, insulate your house with it. I don't really know how thermoconductive money is, but
So what you're saying is no strange Belgian pseudonymous billionaire has come to you and offered us money for what we're already doing.
No one has come to me and offered us money unless it's in exchange for extra episodes, t-shirts, or books.
We're not moving the show onto Rumble.
Oh God, no! I'm not being a streamer. I like having the facilities to edit.
Speaking of money,
yes,
we don't. Just to let everyone know, we don't actually make really any money from this show. We do it for love. We do. We have wonderful patrons. And if you're not a patron, please feel free to join for as little as £1 a month, because it does help us cover costs. We were at the Big London Tattoo Show this weekend. Hello to everyone that we met. Hello, by the way. This is Beneath the Skin.
Show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I am one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. And on the topic of money,
some of you might be new. Some of you might be new to the show because we handed out a lot of cards. So if you're kind of new and we met you at the weekend, like really, really welcome. But yeah, we joke about money, but we don't do this as a money making enterprise. Nevertheless, we did do some cool stuff for the convention, including some amazing shirts and stuff. So Tom will tell you we've now got the convention leftovers available just to cover costs on our web shop.
My flat is currently overrun with merchandise. If you would like a fantastic Greg Irons inspired t-shirt redesigned by one Mr. Al Pomeroy, it's available on our shop.
Thank you to Greg Irons' nephew Ian Green for pouring that little kind of humble effort to get Greg's name out there to everyone.
Yeah, and we also have our usual stock of t-shirts, our cool 80s Dungeons and Dragons shirt designed by Brighton's own Sammy Hellride. We have some cool Gamages posters. We unfortunately do not have any more of Matt's books. They are all sold out, but we do have a cool flash book of Jessie Knight's best of book, a little booklet that we made to get her wonderful work out there. So that's available on our web shop as well. Everything is sent tracked, so you can get it in the UK next day, or if you are in the US within the week. Like Matt said, we don't really make much money out of this show. In fact, probably I spend more money on this show than I actually make. But if you enjoy the show and you want to support us, maybe check out the Patreon, maybe buy a shirt or a book or a poster, and we'll throw in some goodies for free with every order. But with that out of the way, we are going to talk about something today that a couple of weeks ago on a Friday evening, we were just like very frenetically sending voice notes back and forth about, and it's something that we haven't really touched on in the show since we started, and it's something that like maybe 15-20 years ago was like a super mainstay of tattooing as an art form, and to some extent it still is, but is a bit more has, I suppose, changed a lot over the intervening years. But that is lettering. Lettering is ironically the foundation of so much tattooing.
100%. And like, as all these things, it comes from a certain place, right? I think it seems quite strange to say that in a way because words is words and letters is letters. But I think what we think about as lettering in tattooing has a really interesting specific place and time. And then so I want to start, Tom, just talk about initially just some of the history and give you some overview, and then we'll talk about a few specific artists who I think have been really important and are really important in how lettering has developed. I don't know. I think as all of these things, as we say on a poster that you can buy in a web shop, it is Ed Hardy's world, and we are just living in it. But I found an article written by Ed back in 2000 for the amazing Skin and Ink magazine, November 2000. And he wrote a regular column for Bob Baxter's Skin and Ink magazine, which, in hindsight, was really influential on me. I remember picking up copies of that magazine fairly regularly, and I don't remember this specific article, but I did have this issue because I remember the cover very vividly. But he wrote an article called "Written on the Skin," where he talks about the history of lettering tattooing. So I'm going to just quickly read what he says about the kind of deep history, and then we're going to talk about the specific thing that he focuses on, because I think it's really interesting, and I kind of learned. So, of course, like, the first thing to say is, of course, writing in tattooing is very old indeed, and a lot of the, even the earliest Western tattoos, pilgrims have lettering in them. So, and then there's, particularly in for example, the criminal record sets of the 18th century tattoos, there's very often names or slogans are kind of present. So when we talk about lettering, we don't just mean, right, like words written on the skin. I think we mean something a bit more specific. I think we mean something a bit more decorative, a bit more kind of lettering as form.
I think the correct term is calligographic.
Calligographic. Yeah, calligographic. Yeah. So again, to quote Ed here. So they said simple serif printing and semi-fancy script names and slogans were refined by Bob Shaw, Zeke Owens, and others on Long Beach Pike. These kind of like flowing filigreed things, and that thing that we come to know of as the tattoo font, or I used to call the tattoo font the stuff I've got on my knuckles, these kind of thick, thin serifs, which is actually a lettering style that comes out of that exact kind of actually sort of hard, like engraving in metal, for example, in the 18th, 19th century. But really, when we talk about lettering tattooing, like the kind of words as and letters as graphic, we're talking about, really, in tattooing at least, Jack Rudy and Charlie Cartwright coming out of East LA, and that puts tattooing and puts lettering tattooing in a really specific kind of context. There's a nice quote in an interview which we'll talk about more later on. The quote's by the interviewer Nick Colella, who says, "Black and grey and lettering are married." Right. So lettering as a sort of civic tattoo style comes out of, and we'll talk about this in a lot more extensive detail in this episode, comes out of the specific culture of black and grey tattooing in East LA as it's related to Chicano, Cholo, Mexican American, and the hybridization forms of that art style in the 1970s onwards. And it gets a new resurgence in the early 2000s, again, for reasons we'll talk about. But we're really tracing this idea back, in tattooing at least, to the mid-1970s, Good Time Charlie's, Charlie Cartwright, Jack Rudy in particular, and the other guys that worked there, Freddie Negretti, for example.
And it's funny because this is like, it not necessarily full circle, but I have had a fascination for years at this stage with typography, fonts, if you're talking computers, and like calligraphy and all forms of essentially like using letter forms as a type of art. And you'll enjoy this, Matt. I remember when I was studying journalism and we had to do a class about newspaper layout. Now, it was a year-long class where we had an incredible layout designer teacher. There was like 5 of us in the class, and like He brought in a DVD copy of Freedom on the Fence and showed it to us. He brought in original copies of Emigre as well.
What's Emigre?
You don't know what
No,
Emigre is?
I don't Emigre. Let's tell the listeners.
So Emigre was a design magazine that originated around the same time as the digitization of typography. So that is like inputting typographic fonts into computers. So it was a magazine for graphic designers and people who were trying to design what digital fonts on computers look like. But they were creating this like insane art in this magazine out of like, here's how these fonts should look like, and here's how these typefaces should look like. And it stuck in my brain, and like ever since then I've been obsessed with like how typefaces look, and it's translated so much more into, I have a very particular interest in art that's made using Arabic lettering, but as well as we're talking about now, more Western styles of tattoo lettering.
Also, what happens in a way here, what this story is once we look at where these letter forms come into tattooing from, then we can look at, and that's what we're going to do, we'll look into where they come from in the source material. So let me quote from Ed in this article written on the skin.
Mm-hmm.
So as things happened, he says, I opened Tattoo City in the fall of 77. RIP Tattoo City is different location from that one, but closing later this year. Shout out to Doug. So anyway, I opened Tattoo City in the fall of 77 in the Mission District, inspired by the Good Time Charlie model. Bob Roberts was working with me, an LA native who'd been around graffiti and Chicano culture all his life. And we were hanging out with the LA guys as much as we could. He'd met both Jack and Charlie at the Reno convention, which we talked about on the podcast. Jack was sharing his knowledge of the intricacies of gang graffiti style writing. It was phenomenal, calligraphic style, very complex, endlessly expressive. The next spring, Charlie decided to retire from tattooing, and I bought the East LA shop to keep the style going with Jack as manager. Within a few months later, the building got bought out from under us due to a business stupidity on my part, and we moved down the street to a new location that I called Tattoo Land. Here, Jack, Freddie, Negretti, and others, a few people held down the fort. During the 7 years of Tattoo Land, I'd make monthly trips to East LA to tattoo, hang out, and observe great styles those guys were putting out. A lot of the tattoos involved writing, and of course the neighborhoods, particularly the alleys, were covered with graffiti. Most of it was a secret code between gangs for those in the know. Occasionally I'd photograph outstanding examples, knowing nearly all of it had a much shorter life than tattoos, fated to be crossed out by the rival gang or painted over by the people who owned the building. Some of it was spectacular, but when someone tagged our little building, we painted it out immediately. Jack likened it to dogs pissing on their territory and said if we allowed it to stand, other graffiti would join in as rivals and we'd want to leave their calling cards. Jack was raised amongst all that culture, although he was never in gangs. His nickname, Huero, means whitey, and is a standard moniker for Caucasians raised in Chicano neighborhoods. He established his shop in a neutral corridor of Whittier Boulevard, not specifically claimed by any gang, but through which a lot of them traveled. If you were renting a space in a particular neighborhood that was under the sway of, say, the White Fence Gang, you might be informed you were only to tattoo members of that gang, despite the fact it was your business. But all kinds of people got tattooed at Tattoo Land, and among them were a fair share of gangbangers. So essentially, this script style that was transformed. I don't know if you can see these designs I'm showing up to you, Tom.
Yeah,
we
I
have
can see
these we have these designs from Jack Reed. Right, coming out of basically the styles that were popular in graffiti on walls.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and this sort of style that Jack Rudy was doing is kind of the predominant example of when you talk about lettering, what people think about as well. It's like, imagine like Tupac's stomach tattoo. That is exactly what we're talking about.
Right, and so the anchor point for this article actually is the publication of a book, which is super interesting. A book called Wall Banging, Graffiti and Gangs in LA by Susan A. Phillips. It was a doctoral thesis and then a book. She's an anthropologist and photographer. And super interesting because it talks about tattooing, but it talks about the kind of culture of this place, East LA, Chicano, Mexican Americans, it through the context of its letter forms and like the politics of letter forms, which is really fascinating. So I don't know how much do you know much about the Chicano culture, Tom? Like if I say Chicano to you, do you sort of understand what that
Yeah. No,
means?
I understand. And also, as a point, before we proceed, I want to acknowledge that, like, I understand that, like, calligraphic, correct term, the use of letter forms as art is like, wasn't really invented in the West. Like I mentioned, Arabic lettering as a form of art that's particularly in Islam. There's not a huge amount of representative art, so stuff like calligraphy and
Yeah,
architecture is used as a form of praise of Allah, and also similarly in Japan, also huge history, and similarly in China of
right,
calligraphic art as well. So just
right.
wanted to say that. But yeah, like when you are looking at this like Chicano forms, it comes from like particularly the way that like serifs are drawn is like very much drawn from, spray painting of cars, graffiti, and it's
Yeah,
predominantly
and
black and
very
grey.
yeah, and so it comes out. So the Chicano movement is this part of really a sort of the civil rights movement of the '60s,
Mm-hmm.
like rights movement for Mexican Americans in particular, which comes with like post Mexican Revolution, comes with this idea of social justice, of workers' rights, of immigration, and lots of discussion about indigenous rights as well. Um,
and
so it's a
also the
very kind
play
of
and also the place in society of second generation Mexican Americans whose parents had been displaced from
that's
Mexico
right,
across the border.
exactly right. And yeah, and we've talked a bit about before about why the tattooing therefore is black and grey. It's coming out of prison gang culture where if you're in prison trying to make a tattoo, it can really only be black and grey at this period in the 70s. But the graffiti is a little bit different, and there's an interesting. So this is in Phillips's book. Basically, talks in some really interesting detail about yeah what the kind of what the letter forms, what the graffiti kind of means. And so let me quote here from Phillips. I'm going to quote from her a bit as we go through this episode. She says, how gang neighborhoods like Santa Monica got started can either be considered a long history or a short one. To historians, it's just decades. To the homies, it seems like forever. For anthropologists, it's long enough to be an important lesson in the creation of culture. But before I get into that, it behooves me to delve into its history to provide a rudimentary context. Los Angeles barrios developed on the outskirts of towns or in highly industrialized areas such as railroad camps or brickworks where migrants constituted a majority of the labor force. After their journey from Mexico to the US, many Mexicans in the 40s and 50s found themselves in housing situations deemed as slums by outsiders. However, they were judged by the city, such areas and the possibilities for work offered there sometimes represented marked improvements to the conditions they'd left behind. According to historian Ricardo Romo, quote, although a smaller proportion of Mexicans owned their homes than native Anglo-Americans and European immigrants, many nonetheless found in the new barrios of the east side a partial opportunity to make a better life for their families. Yet, despite the positives, relocation into sunlight conditions without electricity, indoor plumbing, or paved roads, this in the 1940s, separated Mexicans dramatically from a mainstream, non-migratory community and the conveniences that went along with them. Mexicans bore the weight of ugly stereotypes, pigeonholed as dirty, disease-spreading, racially and culturally inferior to Anglos and prone to violence. Children were forced to bathe before school and were punished for speaking Spanish. In general, Mexicans were seen as a threat to an established system of Anglo-Saxon values. And by the time World War II rolled round, many considered them a threat to national unity. So therefore, barrio residents were forced to nurture their own forms of homegrown protection. During the 1940s, for example, as groups of off-duty sailors entered barrio neighborhoods 3 consecutive nights to beat up inhabitants, the only protections the areas received were from Pachuchos, early zoot-suited Chicano gang members who eventually rioted with the servicemen in June of 43. So, and then she goes on to talk about the Cholos, the sort of next subculture of the 50s, who Ed talks about seeing growing up, who grew out of the zoot-suited subculture of Pachuchos. And so it's this kind of story that we see in a lot of places all over the world of like social marginalization leading to, and active suppression and ignoring by mainstream culture, leading to this kind of development of a brand new, sort of outwardly aggressive but inwardly supportive cultural context. And the graffiti is part of that. It's a way to demarcate territory, of course, but it's also a way to identify ownership and identity and all these things in a particular
And
place.
even the conceptualization of the Chicano identity is formed out of like the holding of these two tensions of being both a Mexican and American, and like the community not seeing those two as like diametrically opposed, that they can be held at the same point. And as we see moving
Well,
from
because
the
of course,
50s,
for a lot of the states across the southern border were historically part of Mexico anyway,
yep,
right? So there's a famous phrase. One of the phrases of the Chicano movement was, "We didn't come to America; America came to us." Right?
yeah. And you see, as we move from the 50s into the 60s, you see a couple of things happening in kind of succession. You have the kind of beginning and growth of the civil rights movement, and obviously Chicanos and Mexican Americans were a huge part of that. You see the birth of Chicano muralism in California, particularly in places like San
Yeah.
Francisco and LA.
For that, which is a linked together phenomenon to what we're talking about here.
Yeah, so that is bringing the history of the creation of like large pictorial murals in Mexico into the US. You also have the Civil War, or not Civil War. You have the Vietnam War towards the mid to late 60s, which was a huge kind of talking point within Chicano communities, and a lot of members of the Chicano community were like hugely opposed to the Vietnam War as well. So these murals began to not just reflect community, but also got like more and more and more political. And as Chicano culture started to solidify into a more kind of tangible thing, these visual representations of the culture started to bleed out into other forms. So this is where you have it like starting to move into car detailing and then eventually
Right.
into tattooing.
I mean, I like the way Ed puts this actually. Again, through his reading of Phillips's book. So he says, uh, for the gangbangers documented in Wallbang in the book, the placas, the group names and numbers. So a lot of the graffiti that Phillips documents is literal place names or letters and numbers which refer to streets or postcodes, zip codes of areas that determine gang territory, identity, locale. The group names and numbers have a literal life and death significance. Oh, this is from Ed. They identify you as a member of a neighborhood set that clearly is in mortal opposition to a variety of other neighborhoods. A decades-old scenario of tragic and wasteful violence. The shape of the words might look cool and sublime, but they're not just decoration. And maybe that's part of the appeal of borrowing styles and pictures from cultures that are operating on a far more primal level than most of us experience. It becomes a kind of cultural tourism with our skin. We're dressing ourselves up for keeps as 19th century Japanese or 50s rockabillys or Maoris or whatever. By doing this, I think there's a kernel of wishful thinking that operates on the same level as sympathetic magic. Tattooed people in more formalized cultures hoped for the strength of the dragon or the magic Thai prayer or safety from drowning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like, and I think actually Phillips talks about this becoming a sort of self-fulfilling thing that these symbols take on a kind of menace, but they also become therefore cool and meaningful and in a kind of really interesting sort of feedback conversation.
Yeah, and it's kind
Actually,
of the creation of these sort of like cultural amulets as well that go beyond just like art
that's
on
right.
the skin. And also something that's important to mention is the establishment of Chicano Park in 1969 in San Diego, the first kind of public art gallery, if you could call it that, like public place for political art in San Diego for the Chicano people. And yeah, it's really like after kind of this point going into the 70s that you really see this kind of combination of cultural expression through art bleeding into like tattooing.
Yeah, and I mean, the university I work at, University of Essex, has a lot of art from Mexican American Chicano subcultural groupings and their descendants, particularly because it's such an important part for political art in the southern states. So, but let's talk about lettering styles in particular. Then, having established they move from graffiti to tattooing through this kind of interpretation of the Easter egg tattooing. So there's a sort of the typology of these, I think, is interesting that Phillips identifies. So the first one she identifies is block lettering, right? These big sort of square, heavy letters, and again, you can see some of that, like in that Rudy right tattoo there.
Mhm.
So block lettering. She says, "quote Writers use block lettering to distinguish themselves or their gang." But points out that it has a solidity, right? It has a kind of power, and it very, very rarely has bottom lines, making them seem to grow literally out of the ground. Um, she interviews, there's loads of great interviews here with graph writers, and she says, "Well, you see block letters that I can appreciate," says this guy. Um, I can see if something says Santa Monica with real pretty letters. It has style and class. If it's just something like a real skinny line, no style, no nothing, no creativity. There's something kind of solid and powerful. And she points out that um, a lot of the styles in block lettering reflects the kind of attitude. There's no weakness. There's no drips. There's no kind of floridness in that particular style. And then she says, again, she interviews a guy. Creating a large scale piece like this involves several steps. A writer makes an outline in the main color. Then the writer or a few of his or her friends fill in the letters in black. And then the main writer goes back with the same color black to correct any errors. Only then will the highlights and maybe a complementary color like white. Most of us, says one young man, don't got no talent. I can't write nothing like this. But my homies that can, they're the ones that can do it. They're good at it. We got some good people. They're like artists. What they do is this: they put their first copy down on a piece of paper. They can see how it's going to look, like an architect. Like an architect puts it on paper first, and then he goes and designs it. And then Philip says it's costly, economically and legally, as well as socially, to practice a complicated style with spray paint. Good graffiti writers spend a lot of their time doodling on pieces of paper or their school notebooks, though not all make detailed plans on paper before executing their compositions. I mean, basically, the point there is like block lettering like takes a long time, so it is illustrative of real neglect, in a way, right? But also of real commitment to the place and real kind of presence, and you're not just slapping it on and running away. You're spending time, maybe even a group, laying down something really honest and powerful and meaningful,
And this is
for a long
also
time in one place.
it's also counter to the graffiti movement in places like New York during the late 70s,
exactly.
early 80s, when you have like the birth of bombing, where you're like descending on a train carriage and like blasting it.
This is the opposite of that. Yeah, that's a really good point, man. Like, this is, I mean, at this time in the 70s, this is when tattooing is illegal in New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something important about the fact that this style can even come out of LA, because it's a completely different style. It has a kind of like a slowness to it, weirdly.
And also similarly to like translating it to like a physical sense, the heavy like block lettering that's used in graffiti at this time in places like LA is also kind of like staking claim to space. In terms of like these communities, they're heavily marginalized by both the state and mainstream society. Like going and spending an hour, 2 hours with a group of people doing block lettering on the side of a building versus like spending hours doing block lettering on your back or chest is like claiming space, either in a physical sense of the space or corporally in terms of your body.
That's right. And then she talks about the kind of elevation of some of these styles again, which sometimes you see in tattooing. Really interesting. She talks about this guy called Puppet, who was on 29th Street in South Central LA, who did a kind of like bamboo style Asian lettering. You know that style?
Yeah.
That kind of faux Asian. She says, I'd seen Cambodian and Samoan gang members use bamboo type lettering, but there was no such gangs near 29th Street. Puppet told me about this piece and how he creates different lettering styles. Quote, I got these Asian letters from a math class in jail. That's where I got them letters from. They had some math cards. They had these little letters like that. So I did them like that, just a little different. I got them from jail. I get all my letters from magazines, wherever, and then just change them a little. I combine different ones. I can just look at letters now and see how they'd be on the wall, go up and do it. A few little touches here and there. I combine different letters. I like to see my neighborhood in blocks. I don't know why. I don't know what it's about me. I can't write small. See that? He points to a nearby little thing. I can't do that little shit. I got to do this big, right? And then he says, no, those guys back there, none of them can write. That's something I can do. So in a way, it's fun for me to be better than them. I learned from another guy. He trained me in that, but I started getting better than him even. So sometimes now he's better than me. I'm better than him. It depends. I look for letters. I like new styles. All those letters you see, those letters are all my own. I don't like to copy what I see, right? You can see like even that those sort of analogs to tattooing, right? Of like apprenticeships and scale and form and innovation and taking things from magazines. And so block lettering and the solidity is the first one. Second one, she talks about gendered graffiti, handwriting, which she reads largely with female gang members, though not exclusively. Handwriting or double handwriting, characteristic of Chicano gang tattooing, is seen sometimes in graffiti, although it's less common than the block letter style previously. Gang members consider it beautiful. It's most commonly associated with women. However, men use it in prison art compositions, also in memorial compositions. Handwriting is a softer alternative to the hard-edged letters.
And also as well, I think you should point out as well that like the memorial culture started to change in the 70s with the emergence of like gang culture in California as well, that like there were more memorial murals going up around this time due to like people dying from gang violence.
Yeah, and this is something which actually Phillips puts as one of the sort of questions she starts with in the book, is like why these people she's talking to live such violent lives full of such death and danger, but at the same time they are deeply beset, of course, with sorrow and religious belief and faith, and to an outsider those things can perhaps feel, by her account at least, like contradictory, but of course they're not. And she thinks very meaningfully about those kind of questions, right? That relationship between the letter forms and the genderedness of them, actually, and then the memorial and mourning culture. So she cites a graffiti writer who says a lot of people respect that style, that handwriting style, because it's nice the way they can make a plain letter look with so much style, with so much to it, more than just 3 lines making an N or 1 line making an I. It's not just a line with a dot; it's a line with like a little swirl for the dot. Gives it a little style. It looks nice. And then there is there's this kind of idea that this has this kind of gendered code to it, and we see a lot of kind of that more soft, flowy stuff too. And then here's the most interesting one, and this is one thing I really wanted to talk to you about, because I didn't know this until I started researching this episode. It's Old English.
Yep.
Like Gothic block letter script.
Oh, now we're talking to my area of knowledge. Now
we're talking. Right. So Old English, which became, through tattooing in particular, became a huge cliche. The Old English belly rocker, that comes as well out of Chicano, East LA, graffiti. Now, there's no one answer, but there's some good theories, and I'll see which one I find the most convincing. But do you have any ideas, Tom, why Old English letter styles have been popular in LA?
If I was to hazard a guess, it's probably because black letter inscripted Bibles were heavily distributed within Mexico after the conquest.
That is one theory. Well done. That is one theory.
I didn't know that beforehand, but it was a good guess.
That is one theory. The theory that I like, on your computer in front of you now, Google the LA Times for me.
Ah, yes. It's because the LA Times font is in black letter.
Correct. The masthead of the LA Times has been in Old English lettering since the 1940s.
Specifically, black letter, Matt. Use the correct art terms.
Yeah. And it gets called Old English in this graffiti book and as a tattoo style, right? So I want to read you this because, again, Phillips talks about this in specific detail. He says, I found no definitive explanation for the use of Old English letters by Chicano gangs, but some relate it to domestic architecture in Los Angeles or to traditional Mexican religious imagery. Old English type has also been used for the LA Times masthead for years. No one knows when Chicano gangs started to use Old English letters. I've heard people casually offer they go all the way back to the 40s. Oh, that's what goes back to the 40s. The LA Times has probably been using it for longer than that.
Mm-hmm.
Looking through the 50 or so photographs of gang graffiti from 1965 that I have access to, I didn't see even a hint of Old English lettering, nor any attempts at even basic block lettering. Some Old English is evident in the work of some anthropologists who studied in the 70s, but one rich collection from 1974 entirely lacks the Old English genre. His travel, this is a guy called Leonard Nardle's travels through Los Angeles were far and wide, extending from Hollywood to the West Side to East LA to South Central. My guess is that Old English did not come into play as a focus for graffiti until a few years into the 70s. It's a style people are curious about. Admiration for it shared among gang and non-gang populations, the latter of which often marvel at the skill with which Chicano gang members produce it. So this is basically right. Like it's old, it's prestigious, it's got heft now, and certainly that's the cadence it took on when it was revived in the 90s and 2000s. But in the 70s, by this account at least, it's brand new. It's the hip new shit in the 70s, at least as far as Phillips is concerned. I don't know if there's a bit more recent research on that. There may well be. Well, certainly Phillips' argument.
Part of the, I suppose, art historical argument around like black letter and Old English type being new in the 70s is probably because, one, the move towards the typewriter in the 1920s and a little bit earlier, the font type that's used on typewriter is a very like slim serif font. If it is a serif font, the most print in newspapers had moved to like a sans serif font. So it was kind of like a holdover of a different time that wasn't typographically used all that much, other than like mastheads, liturgical documents, stuff like that. So it is kind of reclaiming something old as new. Also in the 70s, that's really the birth of like, although it mightn't have really been an influence, is like the birth of digital typefaces. So those were also like slim serif fonts if they weren't like ASCII sans serif fonts.
Well, it's also a it's also for graffiti, in like the block letter, it's also complicated to do, takes time, right?
Also as well, because it's like old and it harkens back to kind of a kind of art where typography was treated as art, like has this kind of like power and esteem to it as well that like regular sans serif fonts wouldn't necessarily have.
Yeah, it has a dignity, right? It has
and an elegance as well.
An elegance, yeah. Just trying to look at some research, I did notice that Morrissey has loads of Chicano fans and does his official tour shirts in LA in Old English letters, apparently.
Morrissey is really popular in Mexico for some reason.
Yeah, there we go. This is what I'm just reading.
Yep.
Hey, are you enjoying the show? If you really like Beneath the Skin and you want to help support us, you can do so on Patreon. For little as £5 a month, you can help make this show possible, help us buy research materials. So if you like the show and you want to support us, consider kicking us a few quid a month. And you'll get everything from bonus episodes to Q&As, and you can even vote on what tattoo I'll get when we reach a certain subscriber count. Matt, have you got anything to say?
You should really definitely fund the Patreon, because tattoo history is massive, right? Deep, wide, complicated. We're covering some big hit topics on the main feed, but on the Patreon subscriber-only feed, we'll be getting into some really more interesting, niche, deep topics you don't want to miss out on. And honestly, the chance to kind of decide what Thomas gets on his body is probably just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Subscribe, chuck us a few quid. Don't miss out on the chance to ruin Thomas's body forever. But it made me laugh so much, man, that like for years you saw those guys at the football, with the belly rockers, West Ham and whatever, and it comes from Chicano street gangs.
And it's ironic as well, because now like the belly rocker is like back in full force, but it's like people getting 1998 because they were born in 1998 on their belly, but it's that kind of like spiky kind of new black letter stuff that's come around,
right? But isn't that, that just made me laugh so much that thing that the filtration of culture from masthead of LA Times to Chicano street gang culture to tattooing in East LA by a white guy who happened to be growing up in a Chicano neighborhood to ending up being this kind of cliche of tattooing like over the course of a 100-year period or something is just incredible to me. That cultural move.
It's funny in a sense because and we'll get into the kind of the people who pushed the art form even further in a second, but someone came up to us at the weekend, and I had been speaking to him earlier on, and they came back up and asked. It was like, I have a question for him. I was like, yeah, sure. And it's like, why is the tramp stamp called a tramp stamp? Without even thinking, I was just like, sexism. And I asked you, and you were like, yeah, it's sexism. But it's like, it's weird that both at the cultural moment of where like a lower back tattoo became like this gauche, crass expressions, the same time that like lettering kind of got like this type of lettering, and the lettering we're kind of going to talk about as we move into like the 80s really kind of had the connotation, like people getting fearless or loyalty or family on their forearm, stuff like that. That comes out of a very genuine cultural expression from a specific community. Like it's kind of funny.
And of course, one of the reasons why black and grey has become such a cultural force is because South Central and LA was not just a place for Chicano culture, but also African American black culture, who also, were over incarcerated, and those and the tattooing cultures in Californian prisons in the 70s and 80s cross, like syncretized, basically is the right word, like and that the visual culture of those Chicano gangs and of LA and of East LA and South Central in particular become then the visual language of hip hop and of West Coast black and African American music as well, right? So as you mentioned Tupac, and again, like those styles become very, very important as and it becomes into the 80s and 90s. It becomes, because of hip hop, but it becomes a huge cultural appropriation, if you like. Baggy trousers back again are supposedly one of the theories of the fashionability of baggy trousers in the 80s and 90s is because you weren't allowed to wear belts in prison, right? So people's trousers would be falling down.
And ironically, like this artistic expression that's like very detail orientated and very elegant becomes synonymous with a certain type of like very tough masculinity as well.
Yeah, but also a very kind of, as we mentioned, a very kind of inflected, spiritual, religious. Because of course the other thing to say about the Catholicism and the association of this kind of biblical imagery is that's also pre United States, right? That's what Mexican culture looks like pre the formation of the United States, pre the Mexican American War and stuff.
And you look at the very, very common representation of like the black and grey Lady Guadalupe or Virgin Mary.
Right, exactly right.
Goes hand in hand with this sort of lettering as well.
Yeah, so yeah, and that's exactly the point that Nick Colella was making, as I mentioned at the beginning. Like black and grey and lettering are sort of married.
Praying hands with rosary beads on the neck.
Rosemary beads.
Rosemary beads from Essex to East LA, ubiquitous.
So yeah, let's talk about some artists. I mean, really, one of the reasons we talked about doing this episode is because I was telling you about artists whose work I really loved around this time, actually, around the 2000s, late 2000s. And there was an artist who I think retired from tattooing some time ago, but who at the time went by Katie Sellegren, but now goes by Birdie Sellegren. And they are one of the real kind of pioneers of the revival of this stuff in the mid 90s or late 90s, really. Like they started tattooing, I think, about 96, 97. And again, like, I really encourage people to sort of Google Birdie Sellegren's work. They, as I said, retired in 2014 and were, basically forced out of the injury by misogyny, homophobia, just disgusting, horrific experiences that happened to them and others, and pushed them out. And Celegren's now this incredible a neurodivergence activist and like native rights activist, incredible artist. Like their website, which is still at katieselegren.com, is really worth
The Pandemic Diaries
checking
are
out.
fantastic.
Yeah. They've got a Master of Fine Arts. Incredible artist. Anyway, they did an interview back with Scott Sylvia's last Sparrow publication about 10 years ago, and interviewed by Nick Cleller. It's really worth a watch. They sort of talk about their life, and I'll give you the kind of quick overview. But basically, grew up in a small town in Iowa. And started tattooing in Iowa, moved around, worked in lots of different places, worked in Austin, worked all over the place, really, but found themselves principally actually at this shop called Reed Street. I don't think we've mentioned Reed Street before, but Reed Street was a tattoo shop in Baltimore, Maryland. It actually is still a shop in Baltimore, Maryland. It's still going. Scott Sylvia, I think, owned it or certainly worked there. Sorry, not Scott Sylvia. Seth Seferi. Seth Seferi worked there and owned it, and also it's where Dan Higgs got his start, because Dan Higgs, as we talked about on our episode about him, was from Baltimore, and so Celegren worked alongside alongside Higgs in particular, like in the mid '90s, and yeah, basically found themselves. It's a fascinating interview. They found themselves just finding the whole like street shop environment kind of overwhelming, and just wanting to kind of do something a bit more private and a bit more quiet and respectful sometimes. Although, yeah, Nick Cleller points out, they started off. He said they did it the opposite way around. They started in a busy shop and then went quiet, and most tattooers do the other way around. They start in a quiet shop.
Yeah,
but Celegren, it's funny. If you Google their name, there was people kind of back in the early 2000s, like complaining that people were moaning about, as always, that tattooing had got too popular, and saying, look, Casey Celegren, as they were then called, is someone you can go and get a great tattoo from. Like, everyone should stop moaning that there's no good tattooers around anymore, or it's all just been sold out, because there's an incredible list of artists. They did a lettering book for Tattoo Artist magazine, very prestigious publication. And was just, in the kind of MySpace era of the early 2000s, an absolute phenomenon for that moment of revival. And of course, it's also a moment when Southern Californian culture was again getting a new thing in the spotlight. Bands like Rancid and hip hop and rap artists as well coming out of East LA, made East LA popular again.
Also, a lot of like Southern California kind of like pop adjacent punk bands who were like pulling references from like 90s hip hop as well. Like, look at Travis Barker.
Yeah. Just Travis Barker, like Transplants is a really good band is a good example of exactly that kind of thing. And yeah, I think Celegren you hadn't come across their work before, right? Until I mentioned them to you. Do you want to describe, because I'm talking a lot, do you want to describe some of their tattoos that are up online? I mean, it's not a huge amount online, but this is the blog post I was talking about. It's by Ron Henry Wells, who is an amazing tattooer in his own right. Tattooed a lot of people, including friend of the show Sean Porter a lot. So Ron Henry Wells in 2011 said, I was sticking around on Facebook one afternoon. I stumbled across a photo Chad Coupling had uploaded. It was a picture of a tattoo who was about to start, a snake and a mongoose and roses. Oh, this is a sick piece, by the way. A snake and a mongoose and roses just as a full back piece. He drew most of it, if not all of it, on. I stared at it like a freak for a few minutes when something hit me. That's the exact same feeling I got when I listened to Bad Brains for the first time when I was 15. I was immediately blown away and genuinely inspired. Right. And then he goes on to list, right? Yeah, shows ruin the world. The government's going to invade us. It's not what it used to be. Yeah, I get it. I agree with most of it, right? The shows meaning Miami Ink. I agree with it. you, and to be honest, if you were around before it all blew up, I can understand your feelings. Doesn't mean it's a good place to dwell. And new tattooers like myself, no reason you shouldn't be 100% psyched and inspired by the things being created by a huge amount of tattooers, machine builders, ink mixers, and tinkerers currently, not historically, right fucking now. Just take 5 minutes to ponder it. You don't have to even dig deep, right? And he says it's still possible, although it's not easy, to get a tattoo from Philip Liu, Chris Trevino, Tim Hoyer, Bob Tyrrell, R.I.P., Jack Rudy, Chris Garver, Bob Roberts. I don't know, Bob Tyrrell's still alive. Bob Roberts died. Scott Sylvia, Richard Stell, Freddie Corbin, Chris O'Donnell, Mike Rubendale, Rudy Fritch, Grez, Jeff Rassier, Aaron Coleman, Chad Sona, Cora Flatman, Tim Hendricks, Mike Roper, blah, blah, blah. And then Chigay, Thomas Hooper, John Dix, Duncan X, Dan Sinnis, Cham, Danny Reed. And then he says, getting to the point, London convention, so many books, Tacky Mick, everyone killing at conventions, London convention, blah, 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 blah. And then he says, you can go to Smith Street today, and there's a good chance you get tattooed by every person in that amazing shop within the same week. You can go to Rock of Ages and get tattooed by Steve Byrne and Tony Hundle. You can get a Tim Leahy back piece or a Jason Kundell chest piece. You can get a Katie Seligren script. You can go get a fucking Mike Wilson tattoo. Not to mention the countless tattooers out there who I'm either forgetting or not aware of. Countless. I don't give a shit what anyone says. There's still magic in tattooing. I see it every day. We have real life magicians in our craft. They're everywhere, and most of them are real fucking accessible. Right? So Katie Seligren, they were listed amongst that absolute phenomenal list, and in fact, they might actually be the only person that's not a man on that whole list. I'm just looking at the list. I think actually, it might actually be. I don't think that's deliberate on Ron's part, but I think Seligren's the only person that's not a man on that entire list.
Like,
which also says something about why Seligren left the industry in the first place. But
like, their lettering is just like, it's so incredible because it's not just like, it works on so many levels. Not just like, there's an incredible lower back tattoo where there's like, you can tell there's like there's a Japanese piece on one side and there's a massive spider on the other, and oh no, it's a lower stomach. Fuck yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a stomach, yeah.
I just noticed the belly button there. It's like it flows so well across the body and like works not just as like a piece of like artistic typography, but within the space that's put there. But the one that I want to talk about, and you probably know which one I'm going to talk about, is that chest piece that says long.
Oh, the one that, the first time I showed you their work, it blew you away, didn't it?
Yeah. It's like, it's combining like incredible, like kind of spiky black letter typography with like Leo Zulueta, like tribal. It's nasty. It's fucking huge. Like, all the black is just so incredibly consistent. It's like so insanely beautiful. If you're listening to this and you want to know what is that picture, is going to be on the Instagram.
Amazing. And Seligren specifically credits, of course, Jack Rudy for the inspiration. The other person that they credit, actually, and this surprised me a bit just timeline wise, is Mr. Cartoon.
Yeah.
And Mr. Cartoon actually didn't start tattooing, as if you knew this, he didn't start tattooing until the 90s.
Yeah.
He'd been painting cars and doing graffiti and stuff since the 60s. Since the 70s. He was born in 64. Apparently, he got his, according to Wikipedia, he got his first paying job doing illustrations for a client of the print shop of his parents, compared to his father having him work on logos and menu designs. And he would like design cars and murals and Mr. Cartoon Mark Machado, who has tattooed like tons of people, like a lot of the most famous like basketball players, and I think he tattooed Kobe Bryant, for example. Tattooed like Kobe Bryant, Dr. Dre, 50 Cent. Oh, he did the portrait of Eminem's daughter.
Oh.
the really famous black and grey portrait of it. Christina Aguilera, Travis Barker, Pink, Beyonce, Danny Trejo, Shaquille, Snoop Dogg, and Lewis Hamilton. He did a lot of the art for Cypress Hill. Incredible. Anyway, so he got into tattooing quite late, but came out of that specific California, East LA like vibe. He's incredible and became, he's done stuff for Toyota and Nike and all kinds of people now. In the 90s, and then I think the last three that I want to talk about artists, two of whom are sadly no longer with us. All of whom come out of graffiti. One of whom is Norm, and I think we probably could and should at one point in the future do a whole episode about Norm. Norm Wilrise, who Norm died in 2019, and is left left a huge amount of love behind him. I only met him very briefly once. He tattooed my friend Kevin at the London convention. Norm got his kind of start with various graffiti gangs. And in fact, if you Google him, he's as much a kind of feature of graffiti forums and graffiti subreddits as a legend as he is with tattooers. He passed away in October 2019. He had traveled a lot. He worked at a shop called Love Letters Tattoo. Tattooed Marilyn Manson amongst other people. But was just this beautiful, beautiful artist who had this really particular style of very kind of heavy, sort of a kind of weird hybrid style of Old English and script, which was very distinctive of his style. Just a very, very good dude. A guy called Boog, who was also died not that long ago, 2021. Boog Starr, who died of cancer of the larynx. Boog was again like just doing these incredible flash books, if you like, of script to try and help spread the word. A guy called Franco Vescovi left a comment on his final Instagram post. You did so many things first. You were a true pioneer. You hustled harder than anyone I know. Norm is probably happy to see you on the other side, and we'll all see life. I don't know. Maybe we can quickly talk about what you make of Norm and Boog, and then we'll talk about the last person I want to talk about. Like Norm first. Like describe Norm's work to me or to the listeners. Norm says, while you're looking at, he said, lettering is just the shit. Lettering is amazing. I didn't study it. I just wanted it. There was no study. It was simply going to happen. I made myself crazy trying to do lettering because I wanted to be the best always, as much as I can, to the best of my abilities.
Yeah, like Norm is very different from Bert Seligren's stuff in the sense that like his stuff looks more kind of material based, where Seligren's is like it looks like typography on paper, whereas his looks like it's like made out of like raw iron.
Yeah. Although, what's a really interesting thing about him, although he was a graffiti guy, his lettering influence is Jack Rudy. Yep. So not only was Jack Rudy influenced by lettering that he saw in LA, then the LA graffiti guys were inspired by Jack Rudy's lettering. What an incredible hybrid. Mm-hmm. When I started tattooing, he said, I saw the letters of the best letter tattoo guy, Jack Rudy. That is like God. Everyone taught me, he said, both the tattoo world and the graffiti one. I hadn't seen it before. Yeah, I like that kind of hardness that you talk about with his. It looks almost like metal stamps.
Mm-hmm. Or like a kind of like cast metal. Like, like looking at like a really, really decorative like iron gate.
Yeah. Again, like
it has kind of this like hard texture to it. Like it looks like 3D. Whereas like if you say look at something like Boog's, it has this kind of, best way I can describe it is kind of like a smokiness to it.
Boog's, that's such a nice way of putting it. Boog's works a lot simpler than Norm's.
Yeah,
I think would be the right way to say it. But yeah, like Boog and Norm and and the next guy we're talking about, Big Sleeps, were all worked together basically to produce books, and they were sort of came as a three. I mean, look at some of Boog's flash sheets, man.
Oh, I'm looking at them right now.
Yeah, again, describe.
Like it's very kind of like, I would say like 90s to 2000s kind of like Chicano, more so on the kind of cholo side than
Yeah,
it kind of looks like, those like airbrushed t-shirts you see, like,
yeah.
but it has that kind of like the best way I can describe it is like a smokiness to it, like everything kind of
It's
flows.
the airbrush look. It's almost like car. It's as much coming from car culture, which
Yeah.
is where the smokiness comes from, as much as from graffiti, right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of tonality that you get. So he did a flash book called "From the Streets with Love,"
Mm.
um, uh, and yeah, um, like his stuff looks as much like airbrushing as it does like
Mm.
uh, as it does graffiti. And then the last guy is Big Sleeps, who's still going, and Big Sleeps, his stuff is fucking monumental.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a there's an absolute kind of graphic monumentality to his work that is
And
spiky and hard.
And it's interesting in the sense that like they all took like different aspects of graffiti culture and lettering and like made it a different thing. Like you said, like Big Sleeves is like it's way more graphic influenced. Like it's less like if you look at kind of norm, it has like the focus is on the form of the lettering, whereas you look at
Yeah.
Boog, it's kind of like the illustrative element of it, and like Big Sleeps is like this is like pure graphic design and like
Yeah,
is
well, I just sent you a picture of a collab sheet that they did together, Norman Big Sleeps, and like you can see whose is whose, right?
oh yeah, you can tell like whose is whose, like it's like you can see Norms, it has that kind of like 3D, like if you're talking to like Photoshop, it has this like really
Yeah,
heavy like stroke on it, like a cast shadow, has this like 3D element. You look at like Big Sleeps and it's like it kind of has that smoky thing, but it's like it's not necessarily meant to be like immediately legible in the way that like Norms is.
that's right. Yeah. And I mean, his stuff is just incredible, and it's also I think a product of like graffiti pens and things, which are probably coming around more recently. Like if you look at his Instagram, instagram.com/big sleeps, you see a lot of like very like stuff that's done with pen. It's incredible, incredible.
Yeah.
And it sort of went out of fashion, this style. But I think it will come back like all things. We're pretty due a
Well, it
revival
kind
of
of it
lettering.
already has come back in the sense of like if you look at like people who are doing a lot of lettering now, there's kind of two dominant strains. There is the kind of like black metal lettering, like the really like dark, solid black kind of, not necessarily the kind of cyber stuff, but we're talking like this looks like something that came out of Norway in the 90s. Someone like friend of the show Spooks, goes by Noctorum, Noktorum on Instagram. He does quite a lot of this stuff. It's very Berlin. He lives in Berlin.
Yeah,
And then you have like the kind of geometric Big Sleeps influence. That's like it's done in circles. It's done in kind of waves. It's meant to like flow not just as a lettering piece, but like an overall graphic piece. There's a few people that are coming to my mind, but I can't think of names straight off my head.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely due a revival because I think it people, as I said, have had obviously been writing things on themselves as tattooings for centuries, but this form it's so emblematic for me of that period. And as I said, I particularly Telegram because they retired from tattooing. I think again in unpleasant circumstances actually. I think they're a name who deserves to be remembered. I mean, last thing I want to mention, actually, right in the middle of that sheet, I don't know if you can see, there's two letters there, C/S, and Ed Hardy has that tattooed in the middle of his chest, and that is something which a lot of tattooers were tattooing on themselves and having tattooed on themselves in the early 2000s as part of this revival. It stands for Konsaphos, which and apparently comes from a kind of which I don't think actually means anything straightforwardly. Con is obviously with, but it means something like protected by God, or same to you, or I think Charlie Cartwright in his audiobook describes it as like, it's a bit like, don't steal my stuff, or this is protected, or what you like, what you do will come back on you, kind of thing. It has all these kind of like folky meanings, but again, Phillips describes this coming from graffiti, although it had sort of fallen out of fashion at the time she was writing the book in 2000. So there's homegrown publications like Consaphos magazine juxtaposed gang-related barrier aesthetics with politics of farm workers' strikes, boycotts, and brown pride movements. Consaphos, or C/S, is what Chicano gangs once wrote on the walls to protect their placas, the evil eye of the neighborhood. It means protected by God, or same to you if you touch this. And I think, like, the Colorado Museum said, when someone signs Consaphos, it means whatever point's been made has been symbolically protected from backlashing or comebacks. It has this kind of like protropaic feeling. It means with safety, Consaphos with safety or with respect. Like graffiti taggers would put it up saying, here it is, respect it. If you don't, you're going to find out what happens. It's a blessing. That means your work is protected. Quoting here from an artist on Instagram called jher451. Any insult or disrespect slips right off. It can be traced back to the Moors in Spain who use Consaphos in a similar way as sailors say hold fast, right? So I think like that idea of Consaphos, with safety, like this is ours and it protects us. I think you can see again how that moves transculturally between tattooing and graffiti in a really important way. And again, it's something that a lot of tattooers were tattooing on themselves. Jack Rudy and Charlie Cartwright used it. And yeah, I think that's something. If you see someone with a CS tattoo, including Ed Hardy, now you know what it means.
There you go.
All right. Well, I mean, I thought there's a lot of potential more we could talk about there, and all of those artists could deserve their own episodes. But I think, like,
it's the perfect place to leave it.
I think so. Really, really wonderful thing that I think came out of a nice chat that we had. So thanks for letting me do that. And I said I didn't know that about Old English potentially coming from the LA Times masthead. So I've learned something today, and hopefully you guys have too.
Yeah, and I want to thank all of you for listening. As always, this show is supported by you either through your patronage, through Patreon, or by maybe picking up a couple of bits from our web shop. Like I said, we have t-shirts, we have flash books, we have posters. We will be selling Matt's upcoming book when it comes out in October,
November.
When it comes out in November through our shop. Obviously, if you want to save a couple of quid, you can buy it from other retailers. But if you'd like to support the show, you can get a signed copy from Matt directly from us through beneaththeskinshop.com. And yeah, buy a shirt, maybe buy a book. If you don't have the cash, you could also buy a very, very cool Gamages poster. Nice A3 print. You get 2 posters. They're printed on 320 GSM paper for any paper nerds like me out there.
Of 1911. Yeah, we've talked about that on people who listen to the show regularly will have heard our episode about the Gamages catalogue, tattoo machines from 1911.
So with that in mind, I also want to thank our patrons. £10 and above patrons get a shout out. If you subscribe at the £15 tier, you get a copy of Painted People, and soon enough, if you are at the £15 tier, you will get a copy of Matt's new book. If you are kind of in between now, if you subscribe now and stay until November, not only will you get a copy of Painted People, you will also get a copy of Matt's new book. But without further ado, I want to thank Roy Hoxema, Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Charlie Lightning, Shit Jesus, Seb Lewis, Reed Forden, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Ship, James Schick, Eric Wynn, Dylan, Casey Wardell, and Kaya Delis Reyes. All of you, thank you very much. And as always, give us a follow on Instagram at Beneath Skin Pod. It's where we post all our updates on stuff we're doing and stuff we might be selling. So Once again, thank you very much for listening, and it's goodbye from me, Tom.
And bye from me. Bye bye.